Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, the brief and tragic reign of Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico. Now let's return to our story about Maximilian of Mexico. Upon the emperor's return to Mexico City, he began to receive letters that indicated that Napoleon III was not happy with what was transpiring in Mexico. The French ruler urged him to be more forceful in organizing the financial aspects of the government, emphasizing that it was the most crucial element relevant to any potential success. Maximilian was irritated by such criticism, also probably understanding that it was driven by self-interest as much as anything else. He also did what any politician does when faced with a problematic situation. He deflected blame elsewhere, noting that Bazaine and the governing regency should have addressed these challenges before he even got to Mexico. On top of this fundamental challenge, Maximilian was then confronted by two completely different political problems that affected his ability to effectively govern or even remain in power. One was the Catholic Church, the other the U.S. government. Of immediate concern was the December 1864 arrival of the papal nuncio, Francisco Meglia. Unlike his own initial journey to the capital, the emperor took great pains to ensure that the nuncio's trip by carriage to Mexico City was pleasant, and his reception in the capital an acknowledgment of the envoy's prestige and the government's respect for both the nuncio and his boss, Pope Pius IX. By then, subsequent to popular revolutions in Europe, a conservative hardliner. Maximilian was hoping that the church would recognize the need to reform the practically feudal attitudes of the Mexican Catholic Church, formerly the country's largest landowner. Maximilian also wished to emphasize a national freedom of religion and a more liberal approach to governance. In response, Meglia made it clear that none of these ideas were acceptable in any form. Catholicism must remain the official and only state religion. Any confiscated land must be returned, and legal reformation on the part of the Juarez government should be repealed. Maximilian was already dealing with the difficult Archbishop of Mexico, Pelagio Labastida, the most powerful member of the church in Mexico. Labastida had been part of the ruling regency prior to Maximilian's arrival, but was so unreasonable and reactionary that he was replaced. Now he and the papal nuncio unilaterally informed the emperor that their terms were non-negotiable, and that unless their demands were met, the government would lose official church support. Maximilian responded with an official decree that established religious freedom and accepted the sale of church property. Labastida was outraged enough to send a letter implying that the church would no longer support his government, labeling it literally an ungodly regime. Officially, Maximilian continued in this progressive vein, proclaiming decrees banning corporal punishment, regulating child labor, easing employment conditions, imposing mandatory benefits, days off, and the abolition of various exploitative labor practices involving pay and involuntary servitude. Culturally aware, Maximilian also decreed the establishment of an Academy of Science and Literature involving the restoration of various archaeological and historical monuments. So politically idealistic, Maximilian, through an intermediary, requested a meeting with Benito Juarez, convinced that in a sincere face-to-face meeting, he could convince his political arch-nemesis that they should work together to solve the country's problems. Even those within the emperor's inner circle dismissed such ideas as naive, and one aspect of his rule became increasingly evident. All of the official decrees in the world were worthless if they could not be implemented or enforced, and as time dragged on, this lack of actual implementation became an obvious issue that rendered the perception of the government as actually rather ineffectual. April 1865 brought another international development of great significance, the American Civil War, which Napoleon III had predicted to last for at least several more years, concluded with a Confederate surrender. Even worse, Abraham Lincoln's assassination left a weak successor, Andrew Johnson, who would be overshadowed by much more powerful military figures like Ulysses Grant, a war hero at the head of an already experienced, sizable federal army. Grant and others in the U.S. military were openly hostile to any foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere. Officially, on the question of even recognizing Maximilian's government, the U.S. position appeared benign, remaining neutral, recognizing neither the Juarez faction or the emperor. This, however, was actually a break from precedent, the U.S. typically recognizing whatever political entity occupied the capital of a nation. Asked repeatedly by both the French and envoys from Maximilian to uphold this diplomatic practice, Secretary of State Seward repeatedly refused. Unofficially, the end of the Civil War allowed the Juarez faction to acquire arms that were previously embargoed during the conflict. In this way, at least for the time being, the U.S. government felt it could impose an outcome without any immediate direct military intervention. Not only weapons, but actual soldiers, veterans of the Civil War, and cash, both as a result of what was considered interference by a European power in an American sphere of influence, were also forthcoming, further strengthening Juarez's military and political power. And covert U.S. support for Juarez also ensured that the French military could not pursue him anywhere near the American-Mexico border. The military hierarchy afraid that any direct conflict with the fairly massive American presence there might be used as a pretext for a U.S. invasion. It was not a coincidence that Juarez's main headquarters was in present-day Ciudad Juarez, literally steps from the U.S. border. It was also not a coincidence that in May of 1865, a new envoy arrived to officially represent the government of France. Alphonse Deneau was not sent to be confrontational. Rather, Napoleon III wanted a representative to compose an unvarnished appraisal of the current state of affairs by someone with no vested interest in either undeserved negativity or a self-interested positive bias. Maximilian understood the need to impress such an individual, and both he and his wife went out of their way to ingratiate themselves with this diplomat. But Deneau was astute enough to observe the lack of governmental execution and financial disorder. He also observed the emperor and empress's propensity for high living and Maximilian's frequent extended absences from the capital, usually to a lavishly restored residence in Cuernavaca. These trips were also undertaken without the empress, rumors of numerous liaisons with mistresses rampant throughout the government, and always the question of overall mounting debt, the government propped up by loans arranged by Napoleon III's government, money that no longer seemed to be a wise investment. Napoleon III himself did not have carte blanche in Mexico. From the very beginning of the French government, domestic criticism of both the deployment of troops and the expenditure of a great deal of money increased over time. By January 1866, this criticism was rampant throughout the membership of the French National Assembly, French newspapers, and even within the ministers of Napoleon's own government. The U.S. government was also moving off of a position of neutrality to one of forcing Napoleon's hand. Through diplomatic back channels, he was informed that despite a reluctance to damage Franco-American relations, the French occupation of Mexico was unacceptable. U.S. Grant publicly began advocating for a mobilization of American troops in preparation for an invasion. Understanding the ongoing financial challenges of funding a faraway, inconsequential empire, and that he had a choice between Maximilian or a war with the United States, Napoleon III, on January 15, 1866, decided to pull the plug. He composed a letter addressed personally to Maximilian that regretfully informed the Mexican emperor that he had to remove French military support. He tried to cloak the disastrous news with the concept that this withdrawal was actually a positive development for Maximilian, as now the U.S. would have no concern about Maximilian's government, a dubious assertion at best. Although this decision was critical information, Napoleon III knew it would take weeks for this letter to reach Mexico. Despite no formal communication of his plan to Maximilian, the French emperor addressed the National Assembly only days later, announcing that based on having accomplished its mission in the country, the French-Mexican Expeditionary Force would be withdrawn. This information was publicly available and quickly absorbed by the American delegation in France. No doubt it would quickly be relayed to Washington, D.C. Officials throughout the U.S. government would be aware of Napoleon III's policy change before Maximilian even heard of this startling development. It didn't help that Maximilian was not spending much time in the capital these days anyway, preferring his villa at Cuernavaca. Before Napoleon's letter even arrived, both Maximilian and Carlotta received terrible news that was in itself a crushing blow. Leopold I, King of Belgium, and Carlotta's father, had passed away in early January 1866. Besides the emotional trauma of losing her father, Maximilian was also losing a trusted advisor and one of the few royal supporters remaining in Europe. Additionally, Leopold II, the new king and Carlotta's brother, was not close to his sister and cared little about her Mexican involvement. Maximilian and Carlotta were already in a deep depression when news reached them at Cuernavaca on February 14th that a special envoy had come from France with urgent news from Napoleon III. Like a child knowing that he is about to receive harsh discipline, Maximilian claimed to be too ill to come to the capital, hoping this would delay any bad news. The envoy merely quickly made his way to Cuernavaca, personally presenting Napoleon's letter to the emperor himself. Initially enraged after reading of Napoleon's intent to withdraw support, Maximilian quickly calmed down, understanding that any chance he had of convincing Napoleon III to change his mind would involve maintaining a cordial and reasonable demeanor. He composed a brief but civil note outlining his disappointment and sent word to his diplomatic contacts in Paris to try and get in front of the French emperor and persuade him to reverse course. The only concessions they received was Napoleon III's promise to let the French Foreign Legion remain in Mexico and to postpone the overdue support payments owed, 25 million francs in total. He did not waive the interest due on this amount. Maximilian still had some other military support besides the French troops. Austrian and Belgian volunteers had been recruited in Europe to support the Mexican emperor. A contingent of Mexican imperialistas provided additional manpower. Together, these contingents numbered close to 30,000 men. Achille Bazaine, the French commander, had recently married a younger Mexican woman and been gifted an expensive home from the emperor, so he was highly motivated to extend the French occupation for as long as possible. During this time period, Maximilian drew up what he referred to as a new treaty with France to replace the agreement reached previously that Napoleon III had broken. It basically consisted of a requirement that the French military remain in Mexico until any threat was neutralized, with an allowance for a gradual drawdown of troops. It also called for the replacement of the independent Bazaine with a general commanded by Maximilian. When this document was formally presented by the Mexican delegation to the French government, the French foreign minister took a week before responding that it was not even worthy of Napoleon III's consideration and that any French military or financial aid was at an end. Additionally, the U.S. State Department informed the Belgian and Austrian governments that additional recruitment of volunteers for Mexico would be considered state-sponsored support of the Mexican government, as most of these volunteers were derived mostly from Austria in support of Maximilian and Austrian, The U.S. government was especially strident with Austria. Secretary of State Seward personally informing Austrian ministers that a continuation of this practice would seriously harm relations between the two countries. Franz Josef immediately ordered the 1,000 or so Austrian legionnaires gathering in Trieste for Mexican embarkation to stand down, a development that especially enraged Maximilian. News of the complete rejection of his treaty filtered back to Maximilian and the Mexican court in late June of 1866. Feeling that he was out of options and realistic about his ability to politically survive without French support, Maximilian then revealed his intention to abdicate the Mexican throne. Although angry about Napoleon III reneging on his promises of unwavering support, Carlotta was especially enraged by even the mention of abdication. She not only made her position clear in writing, calling abdication a cowardly acknowledgement of incompetence, she resolved to travel to France to personally confront Napoleon III. She reminded her husband that failure in Mexico meant a return to a life of obscurity in Trieste. She left for France on July 9, 1866. She would arrive in a Europe that was in the midst of political and military upheaval. Under the guidance of Otto von Bismarck, Prussia was intent on establishing itself as the preeminent German power, displacing the fading Austrian Habsburg Empire. Conflating a disagreement over a minor province into a major war, Prussia crushed the Austrians in 7 weeks, exposing the empire's weakness. France remained neutral during the conflict and, as a result, subsequently demanded territorial concessions from Prussia, which were ignored. Bismarck aggressively responding that a mobilized Prussian army was fully prepared to go to war against France. This was perceived as the German chancellor outwitting the French emperor, and Carlotta's presence would only amplify national criticism of the regime's foreign policy failures. As a result, Napoleon III attempted to avoid meeting with Carlotta, sending his wife Eugenie to the Mexican empress's Paris hotel suite. There, Carlotta's pleas for money and military support were met with generalities, but she insisted on meeting personally with the French emperor. Eventually, she was granted an audience at the emperor's main residence at Saint-Cloud. There, she repeated her requests for substantial aid and reminded the emperor of his specific promises and what Maximilian had already given up to live up to his end of this agreement. Napoleon III responded by underlining his great affection for both of them, but indicated that politically his government would not allow continuing involvement in Mexico. Carlotta then resolved to meet with various ministers of the government, the French emperor only too relieved to facilitate such meetings to rid himself of personal involvement. Of course, these exchanges went nowhere, and Carlotta then met with Napoleon III again, this time with 2 letters previously composed by the French emperor, personally written to Maximilian during negotiations over the Archduke accepting the Mexican throne. These letters personally guaranteed that Napoleon would fully support his efforts as a matter of honor. Although embarrassed by this exchange, Napoleon III again deferred to his Council of Ministers, who officially reiterated that France would not waste any more national assets in Mexico. A final courtesy call on the part of the emperor to the Paris hotel of Carlotta, probably an effort to bring a halt to her presence and a return to Mexico, also devolved into a harangue in which she berated Napoleon and blamed him personally for the current Mexican predicament, demanding that he personally intervene. As politely as possible, the French emperor explained that she could no longer have any illusions about the situation, and then he left. Whether it was the incredible strain of the situation in Mexico, her failed attempts at diplomacy, or some organic issue, at this point it became clear that Carlotta was veering into a state of mental instability. She began to describe the French emperor in terms of evil and deceit, complained of debilitating headaches, and slept little. She also resolved to go to Rome to personally meet with Pope Pius IX to get his support, believing the papacy could and would unite the Catholic Church in Mexico behind Maximilian, an entity powerful and wealthy enough to provide the support necessary to sustain the Mexican government. Before this meeting, she spent time at Miramar, which seemed to return her to a more stable demeanor. She set out for Rome in late September, accompanied by several members of Maximilian's ministry. Initially, discussions were cordial, and she was granted several private audiences with the Pope, but her behavior again began to deteriorate, spending much of her time with Pius, complaining about Napoleon III's deceit and her belief that unnamed forces were attempting to poison her. After these meetings, she refused to eat anything other than water or fruits and nuts she acquired on her own. Possibly sensing that despite the diplomatic courtesy of the Pope and his administration, that nothing substantive would result from her visit, Carlotta then descended into a complete psychotic break. She demanded to be taken to the Vatican and another personal audience with Pius, this time unscheduled, an unusual demand that was eventually granted. Upon reaching the Pope's proximity, she hurled herself at his feet and began screaming and sobbing that her life was in danger, her entourage was trying to murder her, and she needed protection and sanctuary. Sensitive to her mental state, the Pope managed to get her to relocate to his personal library, and despite an official embargo on such practice, allowed her, a female, to remain in the Vatican overnight. Accompanied only by one of her ladies-in-waiting, eventually convinced to visit a nearby convent, she had a complete breakdown, again proclaiming that forces were conspiring to kill her. She was returned to her hotel, where on October 8, 1866, her younger brother and Count of Flanders, Philippe, traveled from Belgium and escorted her back to Miramar. At the time, it was stated that suffering from illness, she would remain indefinitely at the palace to recover. Back in Mexico, emboldened by French withdrawals and plunging imperial morale, guerrilla forces loyal to Juarez began frequent attacks on convoys retreating in the direction of Mexico City. These deadly ambushes also resulted in the capture of both weapons and cash, further aiding the anti-government cause. Within weeks, many of the port towns on the Gulf of Mexico reverted to liberal control. Napoleon III was deeply disturbed by Carlotta's recent visit, but this confrontation only made him more determined on an outcome that might save him and his government further embarrassment: Maximilian's abdication and departure from Mexico. He sent Maximilian a letter openly suggesting abdication as an appropriate course of action. By mid-October, with the transatlantic cable now up and running, Maximilian was informed of his wife's Miramar seclusion and illness, and that she was being treated by a psychiatrist. Reading between the lines, he grasped the severity of her condition. This revelation seemed to have a profound effect on the emperor, his number one priority to return to Europe. On October 20th, Maximilian informed Bazaine that he would be leaving shortly for Orizaba, a town near the coastal port of Veracruz, an indication that the emperor was planning to abdicate and leave the country, this course of action only requiring a few formal document signatures. However, conservative Mexican elements, understanding that an abdication meant the end of any political power, and possibly worse, immediately began to personally appeal to Maximilian to change his mind. Throughout the month of November, the emperor stalled, making several demands concerning his government debt responsibility and the fate of any Austrian foreign legionnaires. He also began to maintain that he would abdicate only if this was the sentiment of his own government. Despite his own government ministers voting for his abdication, they also indicated that he should not do so until some specific interim government was assembled to take his place. Several French envoys sent by Napoleon III also aggressively began to officially demand his abdication, a further betrayal that he felt was insulting. When he refused, they countered by saying that Napoleon III had decreed that not only would the French military leave Mexico, but the Foreign Legion was also ordered to return to France. The French would also continue to insist on collecting half of the duties collected at the port of Veracruz, despite their refusal to provide further military and financial support. The French also offered free passage to any Austrian and Belgian legionnaires who wished to return to Europe, another blatant attempt to undercut Maximilian's ability to further maintain a viable military fighting force. With no political consensus in terms of a replacement, and the perception that the French were now conspiring with the U.S. to replace him, he declared that he would leave only if his abdication was demanded by the Mexican people. For Maximilian, this became a point of honor, perhaps a way to rationalize what had become an utter failure into a matter of personal integrity. He insisted that he would only accept the wishes of an official body, formed for the purpose of deciding on whether he should stay or go. If such a body requested his abdication, he would be more than happy to leave. Told that such a request was impossibly unrealistic, he then stated that he would remain emperor. Returning to Mexico City in January 1867, Maximilian faced a very precarious future. Told again by Achille Bazaine, the only French official who still had any official access, that he could not survive militarily, Maximilian repeated that this was a question of the fulfillment of the commitment he made to the Mexican people and a point of honor. He also received assurances from Mexican conservatives of additional manpower and money. Even Archbishop Labastida emphasizing the full support of the Mexican Catholic Church, the formerly negative prelate now realizing that Maximilian was the only entity standing in the way of a return of a secular Juarez government. On February 5th, the French flag was lowered from the French military headquarters in Mexico City. All French troops either gone or on their way to the port of Veracruz. Achille Bazaine would remain in the country until March 12, 1867, offering Maximilian safe passage to leave the country right up until the French general departed himself. His offer was continually refused. By then, Maximilian was involved in what could only be described as an absurdly quixotic attempt to save his government. Down to a few thousand soldiers and a small amount of cash, the Mexican emperor decided to march from Mexico City to reinforce the imperial garrison of the town of Querétaro. This force, commanded by one of the few Mexican generals still loyal to the emperor, Miguel Miramón, stood in the path of the large Juarez column that was bearing down on the capital. The government hoped that a successful battle and decisive defeat of the Republican army would be enough to regain momentum for the government. For Maximilian, this was the first time he had actually been involved in a military campaign, much less as a commander-in-chief. Arriving in Querétaro, Maximilian was eventually joined by several other Mexican commanders loyal to the government with a total of about 9,000 troops. This group awaited the onslaught of the Republican force under General Mariano Escobedo, with over 30,000 now well-equipped men. Predictably, upon his arrival in the vicinity of Querétaro, Escobedo did not attempt to attack the well-entrenched imperialist defenders. With a 3-to-1 advantage, he merely encircled the town and cut off the aqueduct that supplied water to its interior. After several days of artillery bombardment, on March 14th, encouraged by an impatient Juarez communicating from his headquarters in San Luis de Potosí, Escobedo launched a full-scale attack, hunkered down in a formidable convent building known locally as La Cruz, dressed in a Mexican general's uniform with black trousers secured by silver side buttons, boots up to his knees, and a large sombrero. Maximilian cut a very surreal figure as he and his officers attempted to coordinate a defense, but then his entire Mexican venture had always bordered on an elongated fantasy. This initial attack was repulsed, the defenders elated by their success, but the arrival of another Republican column consisting of an additional 10,000 men now provided close to 40,000 troops to continue the siege. Clearly, the defenders, with limited provisions and ammunition, would not be able to hold out for long against such overwhelming numbers. Maximilian decided to send a Lieutenant General, Leonardo Marquez, back to Mexico City to prod the ministers of the conservative government there to provide the financial and military support they had boasted about when convincing him not to abdicate. After a diversionary attack on Republican lines, Marquez was able to slip out of town, and through Republican lines, accompanied by about 1,000 cavalry. He was supposed to return with reinforcements in no more than 2 weeks. April 10th arrived, the third anniversary of the beginning of Maximilian's reign as Mexican emperor. Local politicians in Querétaro issued proclamations praising the emperor, adding additional supportive rhetoric. Maximilian, typically delusional, responded with a public speech of his own, reiterating his demand for a national Mexican Congress and his determination to defend his empire until such a Congress was convened. That his empire was now reduced to a small frontier town, hopelessly encircled and facing almost certain eventual surrender, seems to have been lost upon him. To his discouraged defenders, he continued to be upbeat, reminding them that Marquez would return at any moment with enough reinforcements to break the siege. But eventually, couriers sent to track down Marquez's actual whereabouts returned with disheartening news. Instead of heading to Mexico City, Marquez headed to Puebla in an attempt to break the siege of that encircled city. This foray quickly proved unsuccessful. Puebla surrendered, and Marquez was soundly defeated, what was left of his fighting force limping back to Mexico City, where it remained, Marquez having no intention of leaving to help Maximilian or anyone else. This depressing turn of events remained a secret among Maximilian and a few other officers, the rest of the town still holding out hope that a relief column was imminent. On April 27th, a much larger breakout effort was attempted, initially promising, but the sheer numbers of the opposition were able to overcome the surprise attack and seal off any potential escape routes. Both soldiers and residents remaining in Querétaro were now down to eating cavalry horses that had died of starvation. May 5th marked a particularly depressing day. The defenders, subjected to the noise of raucous Cinco de Mayo celebrations audible from Republican lines, as well as an especially ferocious artillery barrage. Time was running out as Maximilian contemplated another breakout attempt. One of his own men elected to bring the farce to an end. An imperialist colonel, Miguel Lopez, made his way through Republican lines and to the headquarters of Mariano Escobedo. Claiming to be an intermediary from Maximilian, he offered to lead Republicans directly to the emperor's location if Maximilian was subsequently released. Escobedo insisted that it would only accept unconditional surrender, but he would guarantee Lopez's freedom as well as a cash payment if the imperialist officer led them to the emperor. And so it was that on May 15th, an overwhelming Republican fighting force attacked Querétaro at 5 a.m, surprising what was left of the garrison. A brief escape attempt was formed with Maximilian fleeing to some high ground above the town, but flight was impossible. Any breakout continuation would result in certain death. Maximilian ordered an officer to raise a white flag. He was captured without violence and quickly conveyed to Escobedo's headquarters, where the emperor demanded the release of all of his generals and associates, suggesting that he alone should be held responsible. Escobedo responded by stating that he had no authority to grant such a request and that the Juarez government would make those decisions. Maximilian was then returned to his former convent headquarters, his room now a prison cell. Despite international requests from many governments, including the United States, for Maximilian's release, Benito Juarez made the decision to not only prosecute the now deposed emperor, but to court-martial him under a statute adopted on January 25th, 1862, imposing the death penalty for those convicted of aiding the French intervention. As the Mexican Constitution, adopted in 1857, eliminated capital punishment, this was a deliberate attempt to circumvent a more lenient outcome and ensure the possibility of the most severe sentence. This trial began on June 13th in Querétaro. In a theater, 6 young officers with a presiding lieutenant colonel sitting in judgment over Maximilian and 2 of his generals, Tomás Mejía and Miguel Miramón. Maximilian was adamant that he would not attend the proceedings, considering them to be illegitimate, and he was allowed to avoid the spectacle. He was also suffering from both dysentery and malaria, but Mexican authorities, aware of several plots to extricate the emperor and get him out of the country, seemed to be moving as fast as humanly possible. The entire trial and deliberation took less than 2 days, the verdict unreleased until confirmed by the Republican military hierarchy. On June 16th at 11 a.m., the military prosecutor entered Maximilian's convent cell and informed him that he was convicted and sentenced to death. He also informed Maximilian that the execution would be by firing squad in a little more than 3 hours. Both Mexican generals had also received death sentences, and collective preparations for all three men were undertaken, including final letters to loved ones and a confession and Holy Communion provided by a Catholic priest. Only a few minutes after 3 p.m., a telegram arrived from the Juarez government postponing the execution for 3 days. Although this was perceived as a sign that, at least in the case of Maximilian, clemency would be granted, this was not the case. Despite several diplomats meeting personally with Juarez, he remained firm, indicating that the verdict and sentence was consistent with justice and the will of the people. He also rejected pleas from such luminaries as Victor Hugo and Giuseppe Garibaldi. He maintained that he did not believe that he had the right to interfere with the process. Although these were lofty sentiments, Juarez also wished to make it quite clear to any foreign entity, especially European governments, that felt it appropriate to ignore Mexican sovereignty, that the consequences of any such future behavior would be severe. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian was awakened early in the morning, allowed a final confession and breakfast, and then conveyed, along with his two generals in 3 separate carriages, to the Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells, the location where he was captured and his now execution site. All 3 men walked to a location in front of an adobe wall. The former emperor, dressed in black, then removed his sombrero and asked that it be conveyed to his family. He also gave a gold coin to each member of the 15-man firing squad and asked that they aim for his heart so as not to disfigure his face. Initially, Maximilian was in the center of the trio, but as a measure of his respect, he suggested that Miramon assume the center position as a place of honor. The general complied, and after some final words, it was time. At 6:40 a.m., the firing squad, from a distance of only about 5 paces, carried out the execution. Although most members of the U.S. government were shocked by Maximilian's death, they were relieved by the end of the French adventure in Mexico and satisfied with an outcome that indicated that such an incursion was unlikely in the future. In Europe, outrage was prevalent, especially among members of royalty. They viewed Napoleon III's behavior as not only reckless, but a treacherous manipulation that cost the life of a member of a prominent ruling dynasty. French public opinion was more concerned with the needless expenditure in both lives and money, the entire affair an abysmal failure. It would not take long for Napoleon III to suffer further foreign policy catastrophe. Following the Prussian victory against Austria, Bismarck continued a policy of moving toward a larger united German state. Internally, it was believed within the Prussian government that only war with France would enable this outcome, and such a war was inevitable. Following a series of diplomatic provocations from the Prussian government and still believing itself to be the preeminent European power, France declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. The ensuing conflict was an utter French disaster, which led to the establishment of the modern German state. Following a series of Prussian victories, Napoleon III assumed personal command of the French war effort, but this only resulted in another catastrophic defeat at Sedan, and the French emperor was actually taken prisoner and placed in Prussian captivity. Although the war continued briefly, the Second Empire was officially ended. The Empress Eugénie fled to Great Britain, where Napoleon III joined her upon the war's conclusion and his release from Prussian imprisonment in 1871. Already a very sick man, he died only 2 years later from surgery related to complications of the gallbladder. By the time of Napoleon III's demise, Benito Juarez was also already deceased as of July 18, 1872, having died of a heart attack as the president of Mexico. Eventually, he would be succeeded by a former military rival, Porfirio Diaz, in 1876. Diaz would essentially serve as dictator of Mexico for the next 35 years, initially in a rather grotesque attempt to force Austria to recognize his government. Benito Juarez withheld the embalmed corpse of the former emperor for several months, displayed publicly, and even photographed. The former emperor's remains were eventually released and conveyed to Trieste on the Novara, the ship that initially transported Maximilian and Carlotta to Mexico in 1864. Arriving there on January 16, 1868, a special railroad car conveyed Maximilian's coffin to Vienna, a traditional formal mass, and internment in the Austrian imperial crypt, site of the burial of all of the members of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, including Maria Theresa, Francis II, and eventually Franz Josef himself. Carlotta did not attend her husband's funeral. In fact, she was not even told of his death until after he was repatriated and deposited in the imperial crypt. She had spent the interim period locked up in a cottage on the grounds of Miramar, prevented from public excursion or even newspapers, only able to receive letters from family members who were sure to avoid any mention of her husband's fate. She remained deeply paranoid, believing that attempts to poison her were ongoing. Eventually repatriated to Belgium by her immediate family in July of 1867, it was not until January of 1868 that she was informed of her husband's death, her relatives emphasizing that he died honorably. For the next 60 years, she resided in various Belgian royal residences, never participated in official functions, and frequently resorted to psychotic outbursts followed by periods of calm lucidity. Modern examination of her medical records and letters indicate that she probably suffered from bipolar disorder from an early age, long before these symptoms were exacerbated by the incredible strain of her and her husband's Mexican reign. She died on January 19, 1927, in the austere Belgian castle of Bouchot, purchased for her by the Belgian royal family. 86 years old, by then a recluse, who interacted only with servants and a few ladies in waiting, much of her time was spent in lengthy silence, followed by brief periods of incoherent conversation. By then her outlook was probably identical to the sentiment expressed by her husband in one of his last letters to a diplomat attempting to secure the doomed emperor's freedom, in which Maximilian stated, "I no longer belong to this world. I am only an intruder here," words that also summed up his entire Mexican experience. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Maximilian I. Information for this podcast came from the books The Last Emperor of Mexico by Edward Shawcross, and Maximilian and Carlotta, Europe's Last Empire in Mexico by M.M. McAllen. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.